Thank you very much, Gavin. Really good to be with you. I should say, as a little bit more of introduction to myself, I guess my main interests in this come from, so I look after the whole kind of academic side of science and religion here in the University of Edinburgh. So I might sound a little bit more kind of theoretical than perhaps some other people who are going to speak. I don't know, we'll find out. But what I am going to suggest in my 8 minutes or so is that the title we've been asked to speak to, talking together, question mark, very important, science and the church. These are the kind of phrases we often use at science and religion gatherings, but most of the words there are ciphers for other things, I'm going to suggest, and I will try and unpack that. And I will ask some rather obvious questions, but please bear with me as I try and unpack this stuff. And I want to say, I suppose, that kind of talking together thing instantly conjures up the question of dialogue between science and faith. In the academic study of science and religion, I have to be honest with you, we've become so fed up with dialogue. We generally tend to say these days it's a meaningless platitude, and that we have to dig much more deeply in order to try and get at what exactly are we doing here. And again, I will ask some obvious questions and hope that this makes some sense and doesn't appear too obvious. So first of all, I want to ask, what is the church here? Now, my background, I'm an Anglican, I'm a Catholic Anglican. If you ask me what the church is, I would start talking about the Holy Catholic Church, adherence to scripture, tradition, creeds, councils, and so on, Trinitarian belief. And I would say that includes all of the major Christian denominations, Protestant, Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox. But there are many denominations in that, and many individual congregations as well. And they have very, very different beliefs and very different ways often of relating to what we are calling science, the other big kind of thing there. So for instance, if you compare the way that conservative evangelical congregations in the southern United States tend to relate to science, compared with the congregations that I work with here in Edinburgh, Scottish Episcopalians, I mean, total world of difference here when we're talking about what science is and what's important in relating to science, and particularly the idea of dialogue with science. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do this quite a lot because most of the terms here I understand as being kind of ciphers for something else. Okay, so very often with this particular kind of phraseology, when we talk about the church, we don't really mean the church in terms of the Holy Catholic Church. We mean particular kinds of Christianity and the ways that they react to science. What about science? Well, again, we find that probably not many sciences are in view here. We're thinking about particular areas of the sciences, and particularly the ideologies that they tend to conjure up. And also, especially going back to the kind of conservative evangelical background in the southern United States, there are a whole load of moral agendas that come up to do with, pro-life, for instance, gender, sexuality, climate change. I could go on. So it's not so much science here, really, as a whole load of other stuff that has somehow clustered around science in the modern kind of mind. In other words, science becomes a placeholder for a whole load of ideologies and moral questions. It's not science in general, then, if we think science means empirical study of the natural and human worlds. So if we're a bit uncertain about what these terms mean once we start unpacking them, and I've suggested that dialogue is a bit uncertain as a piece of terminology as well, why do we keep talking about the need for dialogue between science and the church? Why do we do this when these are all just a whole series of code words for something else that might be quite complex? Well, I suggest that the answer is not difficult to find why we do this. It's because our secular culture assumes that science writ large and the church writ large are locked in conflict with each other in a fight to the death. And just by talking in this kind of way, we are buying straight into that myth that conflict is always there and it's always going to be there and we can do nothing about it, and probably religion is going to die. I think we're buying straight into it, just using this terminology. And by the way, I'm not making this up. This is not just my own thoughts. In the academic study of science and religion, most people now would accept that viewpoint that I've just given you. That the problem with science and religion is not science nor religion, it's the and. Is there another way of looking at this which doesn't automatically buy into the myth of conflict? Well, I think there is, but first of all, we need to drop the idea that dialogue is the answer, dialogue between science and the church. Think for a moment about secularism as an ideology that underpins Western society. It's much more pervasive than you might realize, even among very fervent religious believers. So think for a moment about secularism. Generally, social scientists would say that secularism relies on this myth of conflict between science and religion, and vice versa. They kind of prop each other up, really. Why is that the case? Why does secular society assume, without questioning, that science and religion must conflict with each other? Well, it's a really complex question. Loads and loads of work has been done on it, but one of the obvious answers is that secularism assumes conflict between science and religion because it makes the truth much easier to grasp. Basically, you say that truth resides more in the science half of the pairing than in religion. So truth is progressive as science is progressive, but not religion. And that does allow for secular society to deal with religion much more easily. And it allows to be put in its place in comparison with the primary mode of truth-seeking these days, science. And it also means, and this is a very positive point, I would think, that because the religions are there, religious traditions can then be relativized because they've all been kind of put down in their place. They're no longer the universal sources of truth, of course, but it does mean that religious tolerance and pluralism drop out of that, or rather, fall out of that much more readily. So I would say one of the great positives of the secular worldview is that religious tolerance and pluralism are kind of natural and assumed everywhere. And these are things that those of us who have quite strong religious beliefs about the rightness of our own particular tradition always have to deal with, but generally we know we live in this kind of society and often value it in some rather conflicted way. So I'm nearly finished because I realize I probably have gone over my 8 minutes. Of course, I'd be really interested in hearing people's viewpoints about this religious tolerance and pluralism point. But the point I'm trying to get towards is that if you do away with conflict between science and religion, you then have the problem of asking yourself, well, okay, because I personally really value religious tolerance and pluralism, but I'm uncomfortable about conflict between science and religion. So if I do away with conflict, how then do I justify to myself and my fellow people who live in this country that religious tolerance and pluralism are good things? It becomes much, much more difficult to do it without that myth of conflict. Well, I mean, you can do it, but we need to be adult, as in the church is, about what is really standing behind all of these terms, many of them very complex moral questions that aren't really to do with science at all. They're about, and I mentioned some of them, gender, sexuality, blah, 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 blah. So my suggestion is that dialogue really isn't about science and the church so much as us with each other and other religious believers talking about these extraordinarily difficult moral questions which have somehow become attached to science. So, sure, I'm going way over, and I will stop there. So, thank you.